Welcome, everybody. It's wonderful to see so many of you joining us for this evening. I'm delighted to welcome you to our March webinar with Will Noble of the Londonist website. I'm Ruthie Good, the events coordinator of the Art Deco Society UK. And I can't wait to introduce Will to you. But first, I'm going to run through the usual reminders. So firstly, for auto-generated captions during the webinar, please just click on CC Live transcription at the bottom of your screens and then click Show Subtitles, and then they should be generated. Quick reminder as well that this is the Zoom webinar format. So it's not like your normal work Zoom meeting, which means that we can't hear you or see you, nor can our speaker or anyone else. So feel free to relax. Don't worry about making any noise or anything like that. And as usual, we'll follow up tonight's presentation with a question and answer session with our speaker, Will. So if you have any questions for him, if they occur to you at any point throughout the proceedings, just type them in the Q&A section, again at the bottom of your screen, and I'll come to those at the end and ask them all to Will at the very end. Likewise, you can use the chat function at the bottom of the screen to just make any comments or share any thoughts that you might have. And a quick reminder to be respectful with your questions and comments, which you always are. So lastly, if you have any issues with sound or video, use the chat function to raise these as well. And we'll do our best to sort things out behind the scenes for you. Okay, so that's that. And I'm now happy to introduce Will Noble. He's the editor of the popular Londonist website. And he's also author of 2024's Croydonopolis, A Journey to the Greatest City That Never Was. He's written for The Guardian, CNN, and The Telegraph. Will's talk for us tonight, as you probably know, is called When Croydon Was the Centre of the Universe. Croydon Airport was at the heart of the golden age of air travel during the 1920s and 1930s. And this was a time when, believe it or not, Croydon was uttered in the same breath as Paris, Cape Town, and Brisbane. So it was in many ways the centre of the universe. So thank you so much, Will. We're all fascinated and eager to hear what you have to tell us this evening. And over to you. I'll see you at the end.
Thank you very much for joining me this evening. Now, I know that Croydon is not generally regarded as one of the most glamorous places in the world. But in the 1920s and 30s, Croydon Airport really was this thrilling crucible of continental travel with Hollywood stars and cocktails in the clouds. And although, as we'll cover later on, the Croydon Airport building was not actually strictly Art Deco in style, it was very much the first and last thing that travellers would see of London at a time when it was at the height of its Art Deco brilliance. This age of jazz clubs and motor cars and a burgeoning obsession with both overseas travel and the cult of celebrity. So yeah, we're going to travel back to an era when Croydon was indeed the centre of the universe. But we're actually going to begin our story a smidge before that. So it's Saturday, the 16th of October, 1915, and 36-year-old Mary Mitchell has just caused a large crowd to gather on George Street in Croydon, where she gazes up to the skies and shouts, "Look, there's a Zeppelin." Now, the thing that she's pointing at isn't actually a Zeppelin, it's the moon. A police officer tells Mary that she should go home, and Mary actually responds to this by using what the Croydon Times describes as very filthy language. She actually lands herself in court for this. But we can't be too judgmental about Mary. In 1915, the threat of Zeppelins is very real. If you look in the local newspapers of the time, insurance for Zeppelin damage is being sold for people's houses and businesses. And in fact, just a couple of nights before the incident with Mary, Croydon has been pummeled by a Zeppelin attack that's hit houses and actually killed Croydonians. So these are scary times, and something, really needs to be done about it. So in response to these Zeppelin raids blighting London and its surrounds, a ring of defensive airfields is built around London. And in late 1915, one of these airfields is established at Beddington on the fringes of Croydon. So I've just roughly marked it out there. They're not the exact boundaries, of course, but that's roughly where it was. So you can see Croydon just where my head is floated. So it's just to the southwest. And at Beddington, to begin with, you've got 2 planes and 2 pilots. That's all. And they're stationed here. And the pilots wait. They sort of sleep by a phone at night, and they wait for any calls from the War Office to tell them to go up and try to shoot down any Zeppelins in the area. At the same time, an aircraft factory is built right next door in the Wadden area of Croydon. We can see it there. So they're right next to each other. This starts churning out planes for the war effort and has its own airfield. So this whole area really becomes very aviation centric. Now, in November 1918, of course, war comes to an end. And now there are all of these aerodromes over the country which can be used for peaceful purposes. There are 2 main contenders to become London's major aerodrome. There's Hounslow Heath to the northwest of London, and there are the aerodromes that we've just seen at Beddington and Wadden. Now, it's actually Hounslow Heath Aerodrome that starts running Britain's first scheduled international flights in 1919. So it technically becomes the country's first international airport. But less than a year later, it's stripped of that role. And instead, the honour goes to Croydon by joining up those 2 airfields at Beddington and Wadden. And so on the 29th of March 1920, Croydon Aerodrome officially opens as a customs airport. Now, many different names are used for it. There's Beddington Aerodrome, there's London Terminal Aerodrome, but for the sake of simplicity, we'll call it Croydon Aerodrome. And there are 3 British airlines in the early days. There's Aircraft Transport and Travel, known as AT&T. We've got one of their planes here. There's also Handley Page Transport Company, and we'll be hearing more from them in a little bit. And there's also the Instone airline. Instone is interesting because a couple of years after the airport opens in 1922, Instone becomes the first airline to introduce proper uniforms for pilots. So you've got these navy blue suits with brass buttons and peaked caps. It's a uniform that we still very much associate with many commercial pilots today. So let's have a bit of a walk through the first Croydon Aerodrome. And this is a CGI rendering of the airport around 1920. It's by someone called Archive Sketcher, and he's created all of these amazing videos of Croydon Airport in its different eras. And I would highly encourage you to check out his stuff on YouTube and Facebook. But as you can see, the airport is pretty rudimentary. So everyone is very much still feeling their way through the new aviation industry. We've got another video here. So the buildings are basically old wooden army huts. The control tower is little more than a shed on stilts accessed by a ladder. One visiting journalist describes going inside and seeing magicians playing about with little levers and handles. The arrivals and departures are basically chalked up on boards resembling pub menus. And to give you an idea of how small scale everything is at this time, AT&T airline, who we've just seen, are flying just 2 passengers in each direction daily. So really, really tiny. There are also stories of sheep having to be shooed off the runway because it's still very rural. And we could just see there the control tower that I was just talking about. So yeah, Robert Brennard, who's the first PR man for Imperial Airways, says that the airport reminds him of a Wild West town. And I think we can kind of see that from what we've just looked at. Meanwhile, the director of civil aviation, General Sefton Branca, says the aerodrome looks like either a mining camp or the lowest respectable quarter of Port Said, instead of the premier air station of the British Empire. Unsurprisingly, perhaps, there's no health and safety in place either, and there are a lot of crashes. So in fact, the very first Handley Page flight to take off from Croydon ends up crash landing in a field a few minutes later. On the ground, there's more than one tragic incident in which engineers are struck by propellers and killed. And then some of the Croydon locals aren't particularly happy about their new neighbours either. There are complaints about low flying planes causing a din. One local says, "We cannot sleep. The vibration shakes every building. The war period was not as bad as this." Worse than this, it's not actually unusual for planes to come crashing through people's houses or into their conservatories or onto their front lawns. There's one article apparently which reports a plane ploughing into a house, and on the same page there's actually an advert for insurance against a plane ploughing into your house. So kind of echoes of that Zeppelin insurance. But despite all of these teething troubles, if we can call them that, flying is really this marvelous, exciting new thing. So the idea of getting from one place to another so quickly, it's almost magical, really. In 1923, a reporter for the Standard writes about traveling on the new service running between Berlin and Croydon and says, stepping out of the Daimler airliner at Croydon Aerodrome last night, with Berlin only 12 hours behind, one felt like Mr. H.G. Wells's time traveler when he returned from those dizzy dimensional journeys of his through time and space. Indeed, in no time at all, you can fly from Croydon to Paris, Cologne, Amsterdam, Prague, Brussels. It's quite something. Some of the planes operate more like taxis. There's an episode reported in the Croydon Advertiser in 1922 about a woman who charters a plane from Croydon to Bournemouth, and she actually asks the pilot if rather than taking her to Bournemouth Aerodrome, he might just drop her off at her hotel instead. The Advertiser writes, Captain Muir, by a piece of specially dexterous pilotage, came gliding down on a lawn in front of the hotel, the taxi plane coming to a halt almost exactly opposite the entrance. I mean, it's the kind of service we can only dream of today. So who are the pilots of these planes? Well, a lot of them are proper characters, I would say. Many have been fighting in the First World War, and they're these real daring do types. We've got people like Alan Cobham on the left there, who becomes the first person to fly from England to Cape Town and back again. And then we've got Charles Kingsford Smith, who flies the first airmail from Australia to England. Other pilots of the time have got these wonderful nicknames like Count Vodka and Scruffy the Undertaker Robinson. He got his nickname because he once crashed into a cemetery in Ostend. There was also a station commander at Croydon called Major Silence Miles because he only talks in an emergency. There's a lovely little account that I found of a Belgian aviator who causes a stir while wheeling around Croydon Aerodrome, flaunting his provocative plane registration, which reads, "Oh baby." So yeah, many of these men are basically sex on wings. And there are, however, women pilots at Croydon and plenty of them. So at the time, I don't think you can actually drive a tram as a woman in Croydon, but you can fly planes. And there were lots of female record breakers. Chief among them, of course, Amy Johnson, who is the first woman to fly solo from England to Australia, and she does that setting off from Croydon. But women are involved in commercial air travel too. We have figures like Mrs. Victor Bruce, who becomes the first woman to fly solo from England to Japan. But she also establishes the Commercial Air Hire Limited. And this airline ferries mail and newspapers between Croydon and Paris Le Bourget. We can see one, I think that's the kind of plane that they would have used on the left there. There's actually one incident in which one of these planes loses power and they have to start throwing bundles of newspapers over the side, and you'll be glad to hear maybe that the first to go is the Daily Mail. So Croydon becomes this hub of continental travel. The press nicknames it the Charing Cross of the Air because there are all these services shuttling in and out. And as well as the British airlines, you've got flights coming in and out of Croydon from the Dutch airline, KLM, you've got the Belgian airline, Sabena, and you've got Air Union, which will later become Air France. Flight magazine writes in May 1921, the cosmopolitan nature of the airport was well illustrated the other evening when a party of 6 sat down to dinner. The party consisted of a Dutchman, a Frenchman, a Belgian, a Russian, and 2 Britons. Their attempts to exchange aeronautical ideas were really rather funny. The French, in particular, have real foresight when it comes to air travel. Their government subsidizes the Air Union airline pretty heavily, and early on, the French are flying to places like Morocco and Turkey, but not so the Brits. The government here is actually a bit wary of investing in air travel. This is where Winston Churchill comes in. So Churchill is no stranger to Croydon. He's actually had flying lessons at Beddington Aerodrome and nearly killed himself and his instructor 3 times because Churchill was absolutely terrible at flying. Churchill actually documents one of these crashes in his autobiography, Thoughts and Adventures. I'm not going to do the Churchill impression, but he says, I saw the sunlit aerodrome close beneath me, and the impression flashed through my mind that it was bathed in a baleful yellowish glare. Then, in another flash, a definite thought formed in my brain. This is very likely death. Luckily, Churchill's instructor managed to switch off the ignition before both of them went up in a ball of flames. And actually, it's reported that Churchill, although badly bruised, 2 hours later was doing a speech at a dinner at the House of Commons. But anyway, after the First World War, Churchill becomes the Secretary of State for Air. But even he is not in favour of subsidising the industry. He says, civil aviation must fly by itself. The government cannot possibly hold it up in the air. So in the early 1920s, then, I think it's fair to say Croydon is a place that is just about muddling through. So what's it like flying in the early days? Well, to begin with, it's not particularly comfortable. For quite a few years, many pilots have to use open cockpits. So we've got an Armstrong Whitworth Argosy, and we can see the pilot there in the open cockpit. One of the pilots of these planes describes it thus: the nose engine was dirty, shedding oil which spattered back onto the pilot's windscreen, blotting out his view. His sole companion in the open cockpit, the flight engineer, had to keep working with rags to keep the windscreen clear. As the engines got older, the wiping had to be carried out every few minutes. And in the very early days, passengers have to fly in open seats too. So, for instance, the first KLM flights, which fly between Croydon and Amsterdam, are flown in these Airco DH9s. And actually, passengers are provided with a leather jacket, goggles, gloves, and even sometimes a hot water bottle to keep them warm. The seats at this time tend to be wicker. So here are a couple on display at Croydon Airport. No safety belts, of course. I think these, they look more like something that you'd put in your conservatory. But things do quickly become more civilized. The cabins become closed, toilets are fitted. Some planes have curtains fitted around the windows, and even some actually have imitation candlesticks fitted to give them a sort of cozy feel. So you may be wondering, who are the passengers at this time? Well, they're certainly wealthy. So, for instance, a return from Croydon to Paris in 1924 costs around £12, which is over £600 in today's money. So it's definitely not cheap. Funnily enough, then, many of the earliest passengers at Croydon are Americans because they're rich enough to afford the flights. In a brilliant book called The First Croydon Airport, there's this great quote. One wealthy but very nervous American family, after changing their minds several times, were finally persuaded to go up in an Instone plane, only to suffer the machine take a sudden turn and finish up nose down in a trench before it had left the ground. So, I mean, who knows if they ever managed to get on a plane again. Lots of the passengers are millionaires, like the American businessman Van Leer Black. Here he is. He's got a cocktail bar on board his plane, and he likes to fill the cabin with orchids. On another occasion, when the American lecturer Lowell Thomas is due to fly from Croydon to Germany, it's suddenly realised that he's going to be the only passenger on board this flight. It's a little bit embarrassing. So what they do is they get the airline staff to pretend to be passengers and sit with him. So it's another example, really, of Croydon muddling through. Speaking of Americans, lots of Hollywood stars use Croydon Airport, including you got Mary Pickford, Paula Negri, Fred Astaire, and Charlie Chaplin. There's a great story told in the Kinematograph magazine in 1921. It's written by a chap called L. Castleton Knight. He's a film producer and cinema owner. And Chaplin is visiting London. I think he's flying over from Paris. He's previously promised to visit Castleton Knight's cinema, but it's now clear that this isn't going to happen because he's not going to have time. So what does Castleton Knight do about this? Well, he does the only sensible thing he can do. He puts on a fake moustache. He dresses up as a chauffeur and he picks up Chaplin from Croydon Airport and he says that he's taking him to the Savoy Hotel. Of course, Castleton Knight actually drives Chaplin to his cinema in Clapham. And when they get there, Castleton Knight turns around and announces, "I hope you will not mind, Mr. Chaplin, but I've kidnapped you." And with this, he rips off his fake moustache and cap and declares with a hammy flourish, "I'm Castleton Knight, and this is the theatre you promised to visit." Uh, Fortunately, Chaplin is in one of his better moods, and he finds it quite funny, and he goes inside the cinema and makes a short speech to a rather astounded audience inside. So around this time, Croydon Airport is actually a setting for various uncanny PR stunts. In 1925, an Imperial Airways plane is chartered to take a group of dancers up to 4,000 feet. And here they all start doing the Charleston, much to the chagrin of the pilot, who hasn't been told what the hell is going on. We've got here obviously a picture of Josephine Baker doing the Charleston, and she was yet another of the celebrities who used Croydon Airport. There's another stunt on New Year's Eve 1934 when Harry Gordon Selfridge fills a plane full of models wearing the latest fashions, and they fly out of Croydon and circle over London drinking champagne. They even get a spotlight to pick out the plane as it flies over Selfridge's department store. It's a really clever piece of marketing. And speaking of shops, wealthy ladies start flying over from Croydon to Paris for shopping day trips. They'll go and do their shopping and come back on the very same day. Meanwhile, French aristocrats are actually flying to Croydon to get their suits made at Grant's department store on the high street. So it's a nice little cultural exchange between Paris and Croydon. So thanks to Croydon Airport, then the whole of Europe is beginning to open up. And I think it's interesting that even though planes today go, relatively well, they go a lot faster and they're relatively cheaper. Not many of us would go on a day trip to the continent these days unless it's maybe a booze cruise to Calais. But then again, I would say that in the 1920s and 30s, it's probably a lot less stressful to travel by air. So, for example, the time when you arrive at Croydon Airport, it only takes about 10 minutes between getting there and actually boarding your plane. In the 1924 novel Gerald Cranston's Lady, which becomes a film in the same year, we get an idea of what travelling from Croydon Aerodrome was like when the wealthy financier Cranston, he's greeted at Croydon Airport by a young ground officer in the white sea cap and dark uniform of the Instone Service. It's that uniform that we've seen earlier on. And this ground officer salutes him. Cranston's bags are then very quickly processed while an official in a bowler hat checks his passport saying, "We don't waste much time, you'll observe." And with that, Cranston is outside where the plane is waiting for him, job done. So we've got another archive sketcher video here. And this gives you a good idea of what it was like to board a plane at Croydon. Now, this is the airport of 1928, which we will get to in a second. But you can see how simple the whole process is, and it's got this real personal kind of immediate experience to it. You're straight out onto the apron, and then soon after that, you're onto the plane. So, do we just want to get on this plane? We can do. Just so you can see what it's like on board. And actually, when we get on this plane, you'll notice the wicker chairs. You also notice that the angle that the planes were were in those days. So there are your wicker chairs, and we're now on the plane. So one thing that the description in Gerald Cranston's Lady doesn't mention is that passengers have to be weighed along with their luggage. Now, the author Douglas Duff happens to weigh 25 stone, and he has the indignity of being photographed boarding an Imperial Airways flight and captioned the world's heaviest air passenger. This is not that particular photo. But after you had been weighed, you were up and away in no time. And here's a nice description of a plane taking off from Croydon, which features in the 1934 murder mystery novel The 12:30 from Croydon, and it's told through the eyes of a little girl. There was a feeling as if an enormous hand had grasped the machine and was pulling it forward. As far as she could see, they were not rising. The ground instead was sinking quickly down from them in some quite inexplicable way. 200 or 300 yards below them, Croydon seemed a far prettier place than it had looked on the way from town. I do think that last line always feels like a bit of a backhanded compliment about Croydon, but anyway. By the time this book is published in 1934, Imperial Airways, which is Britain's first national airline, has already been going for 10 years. So what's happened in the meantime? Well, gradually it's dawned on the British government that this whole flying malarkey is not going to go away. They initially actually subsidise competing airlines and then think, well, hang on a second, this is actually really expensive. So instead, 4 different airlines are amalgamated. And in 1924, 4 years after Croydon Aerodrome has become the country's official airport, Imperial Airways comes into being. And to mark the occasion, there's a race. So we've got the city of Glasgow on the left, the Imperial Airways plane, and it races from London to Edinburgh against the Flying Scotsman. Now, I should point out that the plane has to, by the rules, it has to follow the train line. I think it can't just fly in a direct line, and it is more of a publicity stunt really than a proper race. Anyway, the plane gets there 15 minutes before the train, but it's very much a statement that flying is really the future of travel. So yeah, planes have been flying from Croydon to the continent from the get-go. But once Imperial Airways is up and running, it doesn't take long for commercial flights to become long haul. So in 2025, Croydon really likes to brag about its connections. You can get to central London quickly, you can get to Brighton quickly. Back in the 1920s and 30s, however, Croydon's connections were really, really good because you could go to Cairo and Karachi, Cape Town, and Brisbane. Imperial Airways actually commissioned Harry Beck, who was the guy who designed the famous circuit board London Underground map, to produce this one. It shows off the various routes you can go. You see London, aka Croydon, in the top left there. Now, obviously, these flights involved lots of stopping because of the low fuel capacity and the relative slow speed of these planes. In 1935, actually, Imperial Airways hooks up with Qantas to create the Kangaroo route, which runs between Croydon and Charleville in Australia. And there's actually almost 30 stops. So you need a bit of time on your hands, not to mention money. Flying long haul back in those days is quite the adventure. There is a story of an Imperial Airways flight making an emergency landing in Iraq. The pilot orders the passengers to collect camel dung in their hats, and the dung is then dipped in the petrol and set alight to make a campfire to keep them warm for the night. So yeah, flying at this time is certainly full of excitement, but it's not always that luxurious. But luxury is about to become a selling point of one particular service, because in 1927, Imperial Airways introduces its Silver Wing flights, a daily service between Croydon and Paris. Now, these flights are initially flown in those Armstrong Whitworth Argosies that we saw earlier on, the ones with the open cockpits. But in 1931, they're switched out for these, the beautiful Handley Page HP-42s. I really, really love these planes. It is true that the HP-42s are not perfect. So they're quite slow, lumbering things. They have a top airspeed of about 95 miles an hour, and they're actually get the non too flattering nickname "flying bananas" because of their shape. One HB42 pilot later said, frequently we would suffer the indignity of seeing trains moving faster than we were. Nevertheless, Handley Page HB42s and Silver Wing flights soon come to represent the epitome of luxury air travel. They have these really grand names like Hannibal and Hadrian, and the flights are renowned for their punctuality. It's rumoured that even the people working in the fields of Kent set their watches by the sounds of these magnificent engines overhead. Everything on a Silver Wing service is done just so. So there were white jacketed stewards, many of who have learned their trade on luxury trains or ocean liners. They adhere to a special rule book which doles out little gems of advice, such as a wilting collar will do much to take the crispness out of a salad. In-flight meals are as many as 6 courses, and they're served on blue and white china with silver cutlery and linen tablecloths. It's kind of like being in a fine dining restaurant. We can see some of that crockery and cutlery again on display in Croydon Airport. And the ingredients for in-flight meals are sourced fresh from the markets of Croydon on the outbound flights, and coming back you get freshly baked patisserie from Paris. Silver Wing flights also offer champagne and various cocktails. It's actually said that all of the bottles of booze on board these flights weigh about the same as 4 passengers, which is kind of insane. There's also a cocktail called the Silver Wing, which is apparently very popular. Now, I have desperately tried to find out what went in this cocktail because I quite like to make it, but no one at Croydon Airport seems to know. So if anyone knows what's in a Silver Wing, let me know. Otherwise, I think we're going to have to come up with a modern day alternative. So yeah, on Silver Wing flights, it's very much about the little touches. A booklet is handed out, sharing hints for lady passengers, things like clothing and makeup, which we might find a little bit patronizing today. On some flights, complimentary bottles of locally made lavender water are handed out too. These ones are on display at the Wandle Industrial Museum in Mitcham. So Silver Wing flights are really the beginning of first class air travel as we know it. Cost-wise, in 1927, a return on a Silver Wing flight at Paris to Croydon costs £10. That's about £530 in today's money. So again, not cheap, but I think considering the opulence that you get for that, it's not a bad deal. But again, you know, very few people were able to afford this at the time, of course. Such is their popularity, in fact, the Silver Wing, that even the French get envious, and they establish an imitation service called the Golden Ray. Here's one of those planes, courtesy of Archive Sketcher. I like the shape of these planes. It's sort of very boat-like. But for once, anyway, the Brits have got there first. So what are you doing for in-flight entertainment in those days, apart, of course, from drinking Silver Wing cocktails and dancing the Charleston? Well, the planes are flying pretty low, so sometimes you can actually just look out of the window and enjoy the view. Of course, in those days, there are no in-flight movies, or are there? Well, actually, in 1925, history is made over Croydon when the first full-length in-flight movie is screened on a Handley Page to a select audience of 12. The film is this one, The Lost World, based on the Arthur Conan Doyle story. Yeah, the plane doesn't go anywhere exotic. It's basically flying around Croydon, and apparently the pilot purposefully steers through clouds to darken the cabin so people can see the screen. As an aside, Conan Doyle, who wrote The Lost World, actually lived in Croydon, and some of his Sherlock Holmes stories, including The Adventure of the Cardboard Box and The Adventure of the Norwood Builder, are based in the area. Now, in 1935, another famous writer puts Croydon in a book. Agatha Christie publishes the Poirot mystery, Death in the Clouds, which begins on one of these flights from Paris Le Bourget to Croydon. Poirot is on board the flight when a passenger mysteriously dies. Uncharacteristically for Poirot, he's actually asleep at the time. Early on, we get a detailed description of the plane's setup. The midday service to Croydon had started. It contained 21 passengers, 10 in the forward carriage, 11 in the rear one. It had two pilots and two stewards. The noise of the engines was very skillfully deadened. There was no need to put cotton wool in the ears. Nevertheless, there was enough noise to discourage conversation and encourage thought. So it sort of gives you a bit of an idea of what it was like. Slightly later on, we get the discovery of the inevitable dead body by a steward. Mitchell left the other passenger as long as possible. About 5 minutes before they reached Croydon, he stood by her side and leant over her. "Pardon, madam, your bill." He laid a deferential hand on her shoulder. She did not wake. He increased the pressure, shaking her gently, but the only result was an unexpected slumping of the body down in the seat. Mitchell bent over her and straightened up with a white face. Now, this is obviously a work of fiction, but there were some mysterious circumstances on board some of these flights. One of these occurs on the 4th of July, 1928, when the financier Alfred Lowenstein takes off from Croydon Airport in his plane. After a while, he goes to the toilet. He disappears. He never comes back. His body is later found washed up on the coast of France, and the mystery has never been fully solved. Not even Agatha Christie got to the bottom of that one. So yeah, Lowenstein would have been one of the first people to use the brand new purpose-built Croydon Airport, which opens on the 30th of January 1928. So we have to get one thing straight here. Unfortunately, it's not Art Deco. So I apologize for that. It is often mistaken for it, and I think certain aspects of the airport are Art Deco-ish. So we're looking here at a picture of the air traffic control tower. There are hints of Art Deco, but generally speaking, this is a neoclassical design. Nonetheless, it's a really beautiful place, and it becomes this world-class portal for travel in the Roaring '20s and then the dashing 1930s. There's a nice description of the new airport in the Daily Mail, written in 1929. "It was a curious place, that waiting room. A central skylight gave it unusual brightness. The rows of long wooden benches against a background of open-fronted miniature offices where clerks talked in low tones. The spotless floor and polished paneling all contributed to an effect of calmness." To get an even better idea of what the airport was like at the time, let's look at another video from Archive Sketcher, who has reproduced the Croydon Airport of 1928 in glorious detail. You can see that lovely octagonal clock in the middle of the departures lounge there, telling the time in various different countries. Early days, there's also this board on the wall detailing what the weather's going to be doing in different parts of the world. This is actually soon scrapped when it's realized that passengers don't necessarily want to know that they're in for severe turbulence wherever they're headed. There's also a shop selling postcards and foreign newspapers. So, people really want to show off the fact that they've been to Croydon Airport. I'd say the Croydon Airport of 1928 is in some ways a blueprint for all other airports to follow. Obviously, the airports after it sort of did away with the neoclassical design and went for something a bit more modernist. But Croydon still gave us the first purpose-built air traffic control tower, departures lounge, airport shops. These are all things that modern airports around the world still have. Croydon's new airport is not without its controversies. I was rummaging around in the National Archives recently, and there's a record of pilots getting in serious trouble for being caught having a drink in the public bar while wearing uniform. And actually, maybe they should have been next door instead, because at the same time that the new Croydon Airport is built, so too is the Aerodrome Hotel immediately next door. This is somewhere, obviously, for people to stay before catching a flight. But by this time, Croydon is also becoming something of a destination in its own right. So indeed, the Aerodrome Hotel claims in one of its brochures, it must be particularly emphasized that the Aerodrome Hotel is not a mere terminus hotel, but is used frequently as a holiday resort and sightseeing base by tourists and motorists. Both the Aerodrome Hotel and the airport itself have these viewing platforms. This is the one on the airport, and members of the public can come here, watch the planes coming in and out. By 1936, over 100,000 people are using the viewing platform at Croydon Airport alone. If you're not interested in the planes, you can still look out for celebrities or, indeed the Art Deco fashions being worn by the wealthy women of that time. If you've got 5 shillings handy, you can actually go on a joyride from Croydon, where a pilot will circle you around the aerodrome. If you can fork out a whole guinea, you can go on a 10-mile round trip over London. And if you like, the pilot will actually spice things up with some aerial stunts. There are also afternoon tea flights where you can enjoy tea and cake in the clouds and watch London out of the window. It's all very civilized, and it's kind of, a much better version of those double decker bus afternoon tea things that you get in London now. A Croydon Times journalist writes of the inaugural tea flight in 1934. The day was glorious, and cruising along at just over 100 miles an hour, the passengers were able to look down upon London and her suburbs, shimmering in a haze of heat. So yeah, there you have it. Croydon in this era from 1920 through to the end of the 1930s is a place where the whole universe is pouring in and out of. People, even if you're not using a plane or flying anywhere, it's, you might be drawn to it as a tourist attraction. It's this incredible arena of aviation and celebrity. Something is, something always exciting is always bound to happen. But by the end of the 1930s, we all know what's on the horizon. So Croydon Aerodrome was actually always being ummed and ahed about. People asking, is this really the best place to put an airport? The connections on the ground were never very good. There was never actually a direct train which took you to Croydon Airport, so not ideal. In the early 1920s, before the new Croydon Airport is built, there was actually much debate about whether it would actually be better to put an airport elsewhere. So among the suggestions, I think this was Frederick Handley Page, actually, the guy behind the Handley Page Planes and Airline. He suggested building an aerodrome in Hyde Park. Talk about central. Another suggestion is to build an aerodrome on top of Waterloo train station. So the thought was that airports should actually be in central London. In fact, we've got this famous image from 1926, which shows what it might have been like if planes were landing more centrally. So we've still got a year to go until London needs to look like this, but I think we're running out of time maybe. But even after Croydon's new airport is built in 1928, there are questions about its safety. So fog has always been a huge problem for Croydon. And this was compounded by its position at the foot of the North Downs. The airport records show crash after crash, and fog is often cited as a factor. The crash with the most fatalities happens on the 9th of December 1936, so quite late on, when this KLM airliner attempts to take off in the fog and crash lands into a house soon after, killing almost everyone on board. But yeah, despite all of Croydon's foibles, the real knockout blow comes with the arrival of the Second World War in 1939. Almost overnight, the airport is commandeered by the RAF. The Handley Pages are gone, the Hurricanes are in, and Imperial Airways is very quickly disbanded as well. And just like that, Croydon Airport reverts to being, basically what it was in the first place, a military base for military operations to, protect London and beyond. Now, the airport is bombed during the war, but it survives. However, immediately after the war, in 1946, Heathrow officially becomes the premier airport of London. And obviously, we've got jet planes gradually coming in. So the runways at Croydon were relatively short, and they were only ever grass. So as soon as you've got these much bigger jet planes being used, then Croydon is of limited use. So Croydon does struggle on, increasingly doing domestic flights. But then in 1958, Gatwick becomes a fully fledged airport, and at this point it's more or less curtains for Croydon. And so on the 30th of September 1959, the very final flight leaves from Croydon Airport bound for Rotterdam, and it's piloted rather fittingly by Captain Geoffrey Last. Actually, there's another story that I found in the newspapers of the fact that the airport staff and pilots were so affronted by the closure of the airport that they actually sneak an effigy of the air minister in a mocked up coffin into the airport, and they set light to it in a corner of the airfield. So yeah, take that. Now for some good news, because despite Croydon's reputation for demolishing itself, most of the 1928 airport building remains intact. We can see that beautiful glass dome that I was talking about earlier on. Now, the first thing that you'll see in front of the entrance, sort of frozen in mid-flight, is a de Havilland DH-114 Heron. It's the same model, although not the exact same plane that was used to fly that final flight from Croydon in 1959. Even better, you can go on tours of the airport every first Sunday of the month, where really knowledgeable guides will show you around sites, including the departures lounge, and you can go up into the world's first purpose-built air traffic control tower, which is pretty cool. They've got a little museum up there now. And while you obviously can't fly from Croydon to India anymore, there's an Indian restaurant, the Imperial Lounge and Restaurant, which, funnily enough, is on the exact site where the old buffet was, where those pilots once got in trouble for having a drink. Next door, the Aerodrome Hotel is still functioning as a hotel, so you can go in there, have a drink anytime you want. You might not run into any pilots these days. This, by the way, is where Amy Johnson spent the night before she went off. She headed off for Australia on that record-breaking trip. She didn't get any sleep at the hotel. It wasn't because of nerves, apparently. It was because of the incessant traffic of the Purley Way running out the front. But yeah, Croydon may not be a holiday destination anymore, but it is certainly worth a day trip. I want to travel for a moment into central London and Victoria, to be precise, where there's another building connected with Croydon Airport, very much worth seeing. And as you'll be able to ascertain, it is very much Art Deco, this one. Now, today it has the rather dull title of the Office for National Statistics, but when it was opened in 1939, it was Airways House. And this is where lots of Imperial Airways passengers would check in before getting a coach to Croydon Airport, or otherwise getting a train to Southampton, where they'd catch a flying boat. You can visit this building during open house, which is great. Unfortunately, a lot of the Art Deco glamour was stripped out in the 1960s, but you can still see photos of it on when they have these open houses. And one of the highlights is this walnut panelled office that was used by Lord Reith. So Reith was chairman at Imperial Airways, and yes, that was the same Lord Reith who was also the first Director General of the BBC. So he was a pretty busy man, although he wasn't doing both of those jobs at the same time. Finally, let's take a brief visit to the airport where all of those silver wing flights from Croydon were headed to, Paris Le Bourget. So Le Bourget was officially opened in 1919, so shortly before Croydon. In 1937, it gets an update by the architect Georges Labro, who adds this rather stunning Hall of the Eight Pillars, really gorgeous architecture. And though Le Bourget is no longer a major airport, it's still used by business jets. There's also an aviation museum in here, which admittedly I have not been to, but I'd very much like to at some point. This airport was actually used for the filming of the 1992 adaptation of Death in the Clouds, that Agatha Christie story that we were talking about. So I think it's really nice that they did use the actual airport for that. And you can actually watch that episode on ITV Player. So yeah, if you haven't seen it, I highly recommend it. It's actually a very good story. And read the book as well. It's really, really good. But yeah, we're going to finish up at Croydon. And back up in the air traffic control tower here, you'll find a beautiful poem written by Ken Steele. And I'm going to finish this talk with the last few lines of that poem. Alas, those happy times have passed and gone. No more the neon beams its welcome light. Croydon is dead, her halcyon days are done. No more her klaxon stirs the summer night. Croydon is dead, but though her sun has set, in airmen's hearts, her fame is living yet. Yeah, so thank you very much for listening. I really appreciate it. Do you just want to I just recommend a couple of books which have been really handy with the research? So we've got this one here. Ooh, if you can see it, I don't know if that's I don't know if you can see it, but anyway, it's called The First Croydon Airport, 1915 to 1928. These are books that you can find online, and they also sell them. I think at Croydon Airport, you can sometimes find them. This one is called Croydon Airport, 1928 to 39, The Great Days. Do as I say, do check out Archive Sketcher on YouTube and Facebook. The videos are absolutely amazing. It's like having a time machine. Just being able to travel back to Croydon of that time is amazing. And I'll do this one for my publisher. It's my own book. I don't know. For me, that's coming up blurry. I don't know if you're getting that blurry too. But anyway, this is called Croydonopolis: A Journey to the Greatest City That Never Was. This is my book that it's pretty much sold out in hardback, but the paperback is coming out very, very soon. I think in April. And that's got a few chapters about the airport in it. So yeah, thank you very much for listening. I guess I will hand back to the Art Deco Society.
Hi, Will. Thank you so much. That was brilliant, really engaging, and I thought your slides were great. Really. And the talk, obviously. Okay, so I'm going to read out some comments that have come through. Okay, so first of all, Matthew has quickly done some research and has actually located a Silver Wings cocktail on a website. I'm not sure whether it is the exact same one because it's Silver Wings as opposed to Silver Wing.
Yeah, accept no invitations.
But this one is on the website called patrontequila.com if anyone wants to have a look. Okay, David says, very interesting, Will. I must plan a trip to Croydon. Here. Lorna says, what a fascinating talk. And Matthew also says, did Croydon Town Centre benefit from the air traffic, or was most traffic to central London and the rest of the UK?
So yeah, it did. Like as I mentioned, you had those Parisians coming over to Croydon to use the shop. So I think to some, and obviously the airport was employing people, and they were sourcing in-flight meals from Croydon. So definitely to some extent, yeah. There was also Grant's department store, which is the place where the Parisians were coming for their suits, also had a rooftop bar back in the day, and you could actually you could sit there with your cocktail or whatever, and you could actually just watch the planes taking off from there instead. And I believe it was a favorite hangout of some of the pilots too. So yeah, there was definitely Central Croydon was definitely benefiting to some extent. Yeah.
Okay, and then we've got quite a few nice feedback comments. Emma says, so fascinating, thank you, Will. Dara says, great talk, thank you, Will. An excellent talk, thank you, Will. From Mark Amy's. Duncan says, thanks, Will. Sue says, very interesting, thank you, Will. David, fascinating and entertaining talk, thank you very much. Babette says, thank you so much for such a fantastic talk. Fiona says, great talk. Thanks so much. My grandfather worked for Imperial Airways, ground staff due to his World War I injuries. So he was based at Victoria offices, and wonder if he got to visit Croydon Airport. I hope so.
Yeah. Oh, amazing.
David says, by the way, the early pilot Kingsford Smith lent his name to Sydney Airport, also known as Mascot.
Oh, yeah.
I don't know if you knew that.
I didn't.
Brian says, very interesting. My mother was one of the lady pilots. Wow.
Wow.
She learned to fly in 1934 and flew for Surrey Flying Services.
That's so cool.
Lorna asks, are there any records of what shops there were in Croydon Airport? Were there high-end shops or were they utilitarian, given how quickly passengers were ushered through the airport?
Well, I don't. So the shops, I think, were kind of like it was what we saw in the video largely. So you're talking um, newspapers, postcards, maybe sweets, stuff like that. I don't think you wouldn't have had massive duty frees or anything like that, unfortunately. So yeah, I think they were relatively basic, but at the time, I imagine it was still pretty amazing.
Okay. I've got a question. I'm wondering whether the wicker chairs
Yeah.
in the aircraft, were they fixed to the floor in any way or just lobbed in there?
I think they were
For the
fixed to
best.
the plot. I'm pretty sure they were fixed because yeah, I mean even like as you saw, even when some of those planes were on the runway, they were already quite slanted. So I think it'd be sort of like it might be a bit uncomfortable. It might be chairs going everywhere. So
Yeah,
I'm pretty sure they
they were
would have been bolted down, I would hope.
nailed down somehow. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I loved the map
Yeah.
by Harry Beck, who did the tube map,
Yeah.
showing the routes of Imperial Airways. Um, and I was just trying to look on that map and see if there were any other UK aerodromes on there. Were there any internal flights?
Um, Imperial Airways, I don't think so. I think
Mm,
the shortest flights that you could go on to would be to Paris, I believe. So there were other airlines that were doing domestic flights. But yeah, Imperial Airways, I may be wrong, but I think they were mainly just doing overseas flights. Yeah. They did Imperial also did start flying from, as I mentioned towards the end, from Southampton, and that's when you had the flying boats. But yeah, I think that map was created before then.
yeah. I've got a feeling that Imperial flew from Liverpool Airport. I was just looking on
Ah.
our website about the centenary celebrations, which are actually at Liverpool John Lennon Airport, and I'm sure I saw something about Imperial, but presumably going overseas from there, not to and from Croydon,
Yeah,
anything like
that's
that.
interesting. I don't know about Liverpool, to
Yeah,
be
I
honest, but
might be
yeah,
mistaken,
yeah,
but
interesting. Okay.
Um, anyway, I think that's the end of the questions. So thank you again, Will. I think that was brilliant.
Thank you.
It's
Thanks for
really
having me.
set us up actually for the centenary celebrations, which are at another Art Deco airport, as I've just mentioned, up in Liverpool. That's on the 29th and 30th of March. Um, the celebrations will consist of a series of events, several of which are sold out, but there are a few events connected to this which are, still have places available. So if you head over to our website and buy a ticket, we look forward to seeing you there. And a quick word about, oh, hang on, have I got Oh, I've just got a quick comment from Fiona saying, I've read how hard it was for Imperial Airways to make any profit and how it was unfair as countries abroad got government funding.
Yeah.
Yeah, and you did mention that, didn't you? Was it Winston Churchill who said
Yeah,
they
he
have to
was.
fund themselves or something?
Yeah, yeah, certainly in the early days, they weren't, they weren't really getting.
Mm,
Yeah, Britain as a whole wasn't getting funding. So I think even when they got it, it maybe wasn't as much as some of the other countries were getting.
Yeah. Mm. Okay, so what else do I have to tell you? So I've reminded everybody about the centenary celebrations. Now I need to have a quick word about next month's webinar, which is on the 15th of April at 7 o'clock. And it's a special online event where Art Deco Society UK volunteers, committee members and reps will be personally showcasing their own collections. So this event's called A Curious Obsession, showcasing our Art Deco passions. So please head over to our website to book your ticket for that. And I feel like it'll be a very personal show and tell sort of evening where we can share our Art Deco passions on an individual level, which will be a really lovely experience after all the excitement of March's centenary in-person celebrations. I think that's it. Just a quick reminder, please fill in your feedback forms about tonight's webinar. And one feedback form, as usual, will be chosen or pulled out of the hat at random to win a free ticket for April's webinar. So that's it for this evening. Thank you again to Will. Everybody watching will be sent a link to watch the talk again. Or if someone's bought a ticket and they haven't seen the whole thing, you can watch it on catch up as well. But I think that's it for now. So thank you so much, everybody. Thank you again to Will, and see you soon.